The restaurant was the kind of place where the water glasses weighed more than a month's groceries, and the chandeliers looked like they belonged in some European palace. I wore my navy blouse, the one with the pearl buttons I'd saved from Arturo's funeral. It still held its shape. I did my hair the way he used to like it, soft at the sides, a little volume at the crown. Adrian stood when I arrived, handsome in his blazer, a decade of law behind his shoulders now. I leaned in to hug him, holding on for a moment longer than I should have. He felt stiff, distracted. "Happy birthday, mi amor," I whispered. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Brielle sat across from him, draped in beige silk, like she'd been poured into it, not a hair out of place. She barely looked up as I sat down. Just a flat smile and a nod. We talked about Adrian's promotion, their upcoming trip to Aspen. She complimented the wine list, mispronounced half the French, and ordered the most expensive bottle anyway. When the sommelier poured, she raised her glass and glanced around the table with a smirk. To Adrian, the best husband in the firm, and to his mother, her tone shifted just slightly. "You'll die poor and alone, Selena. That's just where you're headed. But hey, cheers to persistence." The laughter that followed wasn't loud, but it was enough. Enough to stop the breath in my throat. Adrian didn't say a word, just looked down at his plate knife slicing into steak like nothing had happened. I lifted my glass and took a slow sip. "To your future," I said, quietly. "May it be exactly what you deserve." Later that night, I sat on the worn couch in my flat, surrounded by second-hand books and the soft ticking of a wall clock. My knees ached. I didn't turn the lights on. Just sat in the dark with my paintbrush in hand, the canvas untouched. At 3:12 a.m., I finally stood and walked to the closet. The box was still there, locked, untouched since Arturo passed. Morning came slow and gray. I didn't make coffee. My hands were still trembling from the night before, but not from sadness. There was something sharper in me now, a stillness that came with clarity. I walked 3 blocks in the cold to the old brick building where my safety deposit box lived. The security guard recognized me and buzzed me in without a word. I nodded politely and followed the corridor to the vault. Inside the small windowless room, I pulled the box from its slot and set it on the table. The key turned with a soft click. Papers inside had yellowed around the edges, but they were in order just like Marcus had left them. Bank statements, investment accounts, property deeds I hadn't seen in years. For a moment, I just stared at them, letting the weight of silence settle. I remembered the last conversation Marcus and I had about money. He had said, "I want you to live quietly, but never be afraid." And I had. I lived quietly. After he passed, I sold the house. Told Adrian I couldn't keep up the place. Moved into a rental, drove a used car, bought clothes only when needed. I let them believe I was making ends meet. I let Brielle believe I was scraping by. Not because I enjoyed the performance, but because I needed to know if they'd still look at me the same when they thought I had nothing. I ran the numbers again with a pen and notepad. A little over 2.3 million. Some tied up in old tech stocks Marcus bought before the first boom. Some in cash. 3 properties, 2 already paid off and rented, and none of it had been touched, not once. They had no idea. And now I wasn't sure if they ever would. I folded the papers back into their folders one by one. Then I locked the box, slipped the key into my coat, and stepped back out into the morning cold. I knew exactly what I needed to do next. The real estate agent was younger than Adrian. Polished, brisk, and polite in that way people are when they think you won't buy. I let her talk. Let her show me granite countertops and open-concept kitchens I didn't care for. The first 2 listings were soulless, slick surfaces, gray-on-gray color schemes, empty despite the staging. But the third one, as soon as we turned onto Alder Hill, something shifted. The trees arched overhead full and quiet. The villa stood behind a low iron gate set back from the road, the roofline soft against the morning sky. Colonial-style whitewashed brick long shutters. The kind of house I used to pass with Marcus and imagine inside jokes and late Sunday mornings. We stepped through the arched front door, and I saw it, the reading room. South-facing windows, built-in shelves, and a seat under the window where the light poured in like warm honey. The agent kept talking about school zones and market trends. I barely heard her. I ran my fingers along the carved banister. Sturdy wood, honest wood. I could already see my books lining those shelves. I could hear a tea kettle whistling in that kitchen. I could see myself here without waiting for permission. "I'll take it," I said. The agent blinked. "Do you want to make an offer first?" "No," I said calmly. "Full asking. I'll pay in cash." I didn't need a mortgage. I didn't need approval. What I needed was a home that belonged to me, not a favor, not a gift someone could use against me. 2 weeks later, I moved in. I brought only what mattered. The framed photo of Marcus and me in the sunflower field, my brushes, a few good pans, the books I had kept through every move. I didn't tell Adrian or Brielle. I didn't owe them that. The first night I slept with the windows open, breathing in oak leaves and silence. No one told me where to sit. No one commented on my dress. In the morning, I made coffee and stood barefoot in the sunroom waiting for the doorbell. It took them 3 weeks, long enough to assume I'd settled, long enough to convince themselves they were being generous. They pulled up in Adrian's SUV tires, crunching over the gravel I'd just had laid. Brielle stepped out first in soft cream tones and a scarf that looked expensive but deliberately casual. She carried a box of macarons like a peace offering. Adrian followed behind, glancing around with the tight-lipped smile he used in boardrooms. "Wow," Mom Brielle said as I opened the door. "This place is unexpected." "Come in," I said simply. "Coffee's ready." I had set the table with the good china not because of them, but because I liked how it looked in the light. The silver tray held scones, pastries, and a small bowl of preserves I'd made myself. Brielle complimented the presentation as if it were an audition. They sat. We chatted light things, Adrian's new project, Brielle's sister's baby shower. I let them talk, nodding at the right moments. Then Brielle stood cappuccino in hand and began to wander. She ran her fingers along the mantel, peeked into the reading room, stepped out briefly onto the back patio. "This layout is incredible," she said brightly. "The light, the space, so perfect for a growing family. You could have a nursery upstairs, or even 2. I sipped my coffee. Adrian cleared his throat and leaned forward slightly. "Mom, we were thinking, it's a lot to maintain. A house this size. You shouldn't live here alone." He smiled, measured, warm. "We could help," he said. "Move in just for a while, help with upkeep, the bills. You'd have company. And we'd be close." Brielle returned to the table and set her cup down gently. "It just makes sense," she said, eyes on mine. "And it'd be good for the kids when we have them." I reached for the sugar bowl, stirred slowly. "That's thoughtful," I said. Then I stood, walked to the window, and looked out across the garden, where the bulbs I planted last week were just beginning to break through the soil. They didn't see the smile start to form. Genevieve Holm had been my attorney for years, but this was the first time I asked her to clear her afternoon. Her office smelled faintly of paper and polish, the kind of place where decisions became permanent. She listened without interrupting as I told her about the dinner, the visit, the careful way my son had offered help that sounded like ownership. When I finished, she folded her hands and waited. "I want to amend my will," I said. "Specifically, the house." Genevieve nodded once. "Tell me how." I took a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Adrian and his wife are not to inherit the property on Alder Hill. Not now. Not ever. She didn't flinch. Just wrote. I want the house and its contents assigned to a foundation, I continued. One that supports older women living alone. Women who are treated like they've already faded out. That can be done, she said. Do you want it immediate or upon death? Upon death, I said, but protected now. Genevieve looked up. Then we should add a no contest clause. I was hoping you'd say that. She explained it carefully, though I already understood. If Adrian or Brielle challenged the will in any way, they would lose any remaining benefit tied to my estate. No loopholes, no reinterpretation, no second chances disguised as lawsuits. Are you sure, she asked gently. This is final. I thought of Adrian's silence at the table, Brielle's voice confident and cruel, the way they had already started placing themselves in rooms that weren't theirs. I'm sure, I said. We signed, initialed, reviewed every line until the language was clean and unambiguous. When it was done, Genevieve slid the folder toward me. You've drawn a very clear boundary, she said. I smiled. I've been quiet long enough. Outside, the afternoon had shifted. The light felt different, sharper. I drove home with the windows down, feeling something close to relief. By the time I pulled into the driveway, I already knew the next move wouldn't take long to arrive. Brielle showed up on a Wednesday afternoon. No warning, just the sound of her heels tapping down the stone path. I opened the door, surprised, but not entirely. She held a tape measure in one hand, a small designer purse tucked under the other. I figured you wouldn't mind if I popped in. I had a little time before my Pilates class. I stepped aside and let her in. She moved through the foyer like she'd done it 100 times. I'm thinking pale green for the nursery, she said, glancing at the sunlit guest room at the end of the hall. Not too minty. Something soft. Peaceful. I followed her in silence. She pulled the tape across the longest wall, scribbled something into her phone. The light in this room is just perfect. It's like the house was built for children. I went to the kitchen and put the kettle on. You know, she called out, voice floating down the hallway. It would mean so much to Adrian to raise his children here. He grew up without a real sense of legacy. This could be a chance to fix that. I set out 2 cups and carried the tray to the sitting room. She joined me moments later, cheeks flushed from moving. She took her tea with honey, 1 cube of sugar. I still remembered. I can see it all, she said, sipping slowly. Christmas mornings, bikes in the driveway, dinner parties under those oaks in the backyard. And you, of course, always around helping. I stirred my cup, but didn't drink. Her words were soft, but they hung heavy in the air. She leaned forward. Honestly, Selena, I think this house was meant for us. I think you know that too. I smiled gently and reached for the small linen napkin beside my saucer. I'm glad you feel comfortable here, I said. Her eyes gleamed with triumph. But I'd prefer if you called next time. She blinked. The clock on the wall ticked once sharply. I stood to refill the kettle, already knowing who would arrive next. That night after Brielle left, I sat in the reading room with the windows open and the lamp dimmed low. The air smelled faintly of cut grass and the rosemary hedge outside. I opened my leather journal, pulled a single sheet of cream stationery from the back, and uncapped my pen. I wrote his name at the top, Adrian. Then I paused. It took me a while to find the right beginning. Not warm, but not cold either. Just true. My dear son. I began, by the time you read this, I will be gone. And this house will no longer belong to the person you expected. I kept my handwriting steady. I didn't want anger in this letter. I wanted him to understand, not to defend. I didn't leave you the house, Adrian, because you never saw it as mine. From the moment you stepped inside, you assumed it would one day be yours. That entitlement wasn't born from need. It was shaped by silence. My silence. And I own that. I set the pen down for a moment. Outside, a car passed slowly. The neighborhood quieted again. You stood by when Brielle insulted me. You looked down at your plate. You let her laugh. That was the moment I saw you clearly, not as my child, but as a man who chose comfort over courage. I didn't accuse. I simply described. Love is not silent when cruelty speaks. It cannot be. I folded the paper neatly, slipped it into an envelope, and sealed it. No return address. No fanfare. On the front, I wrote to be opened after my passing. For Adrian only. I placed it in the locked drawer of my study desk, beneath my updated will. Then, I turned off the lamp. I wasn't writing for guilt or regret. I was writing for release. In the stillness of that room, I realized I wasn't waiting for them to change anymore. I had already changed, and tomorrow, someone else would come to visit. The doorbell rang at 1:04 p.m. I had just poured a second cup of tea and set out a plate of shortbread when I saw them through the front window, Adrian and Brielle standing side by side, each holding a suitcase. Behind them, the trunk of their car was propped open, a stack of boxes barely balanced inside. I opened the door without surprise. We thought we'd start moving things in. Brielle said brightly, "Just the essentials today. The rest can follow during the week." Adrian looked at me not with apology or warmth, but with expectation. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I stepped aside just long enough to retrieve 2 envelopes from the entry table, one for each of them. Their names written clearly in blue ink. The paper, thick official. I held them out. "You'll want to read this carefully." Adrian took his without looking at it. Brielle hesitated, then accepted hers with a confused tilt of the head. "What is this?" she asked. "Clarity," I said softly. She gave a nervous laugh. "Selena, we don't need contracts or whatever this is. We're family." Adrian glanced down, finally reading the label. His expression shifted. "I suggest you read it before bringing anything inside," I said, my voice steady. They stood frozen. The wind lifted the edge of Brielle's scarf. Adrian opened his envelope, first reading silently. Brielle watched him, then tore hers open too. I waited. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. Adrian's hands began to shake. "This can't be real," he murmured. "It's notarized," I replied. "But you said we were welcome." "No," I corrected gently. "You assumed you were." Brielle's lips tightened. She pressed the papers to her chest like they might burn through her coat. "You left everything to a foundation," she whispered. "For women who've been left behind," I answered. "Women like me." They didn't speak after that. Not right away. I watched the weight of entitlement settle into confusion, then disbelief. Adrian finally looked up, eyes pleading, and I stepped back inside, leaving the door ajar just long enough for them to make their choice. Brielle was the first to snap. "This is ridiculous," she spat, voice rising. "You can't just change everything like this. We're your family." Adrian flinched beside her, still holding the letter like it might disintegrate. "You're not thinking clearly, Selena." She continued, stepping forward. "You're letting bitterness cloud your judgment. You said we could help. You said I said nothing." I replied calmly. "You assumed everything." She shook the papers in the air. "We'll take this to court. You'll see. You can't just disinherit your only son. It's not legal." I stepped back toward the entryway table and picked up a copy of the addendum already signed, stamped, and notarized. I handed it to Adrian. He took it slowly, eyes scanning the page. His jaw clenched at the final clause. "That line," I said, softly pointing, "is a no-contest clause. If either of you challenge the will, you forfeit everything. That includes the right to even set foot on this property again. Not for visits, not for funerals." Brielle's face turned crimson. "You're bluffing." "I'm not." Adrian looked up from the document, eyes glassy. Why? I met his gaze. Because when someone lets another woman insult their mother and stays silent, that silence says everything. The room was still for a beat too long. Then, without a word, Adrian folded the paper and handed it back to me. Brielle was less composed. She muttered curses under her breath as she marched past me, dragging her suitcase behind her like a badge of defeat. At the threshold, Adrian paused. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. I nodded once. I know. He stepped out. I closed the door gently behind them. The hallway fell into quiet. I didn't lock the door right away. I stood there, hand resting on the knob, listening to the sound of tires crunching over the gravel growing fainter. When I finally turned the lock, something in me settled. Not with triumph, not with sorrow, but with something quieter, firmer. And the next morning, I would wake to a house filled only with peace. The sunroom filled with quiet laughter and the soft clink of china. A kettle hissed gently behind me as I refilled the teapot, watching the steam swirl upward into golden afternoon light. Around the table, 5 women sat comfortably. Some cross-legged, some leaning back in chairs, one with a knitted shawl draped over her shoulders. Marta was reading aloud from a poem she'd written the night before. Her voice shook at the start, but grew steadier with each line. When she finished, everyone clapped, not out of politeness, but because they meant it. That's what we did here. We meant things. It started 3 months ago after a visit to the senior center where I'd once volunteered. I mentioned to one of the coordinators offhandedly that I had a space if any of the women ever wanted a change of scenery. That simple offer turned into something more. They came in small groups at first, for tea, for company, for stillness. Now the second Sunday of every month belonged to us. I called it the quiet circle. There was no agenda. Some brought books. Others brought songs. One afternoon, Louise brought a chessboard and taught 3 of us how to play. No one had to be anyone's mother or anyone's burden or anything other than who we were in that moment. We were just here, together. I looked around the room. These weren't women anyone checked in on regularly. Some had children who lived far away. Others had none at all. But in this space, they weren't forgotten. And neither was I. I'd repotted the herbs by the window, added cushions to the bench near the fountain outside. Everything grew more easily now, the lavender, the lemon balm, even the jasmine I once thought wouldn't take. I'd grown too in ways I hadn't expected. Not despite the silence, but through it. After the women left that evening, I walked through the garden barefoot, letting the earth cool the soles of my feet. I paused by the stone path Adrian had never seen, the wind chimes swaying softly above me. Tomorrow I'd get up early. There was still work to do.